Either. My name's Chris Buckridge. I work for the RIPE NCC. I've worked there for a while now. I think I'm coming up to about 2 decades working with RIRs. And a lot of what I've done with the RIPE NCC especially is this space of internet governance and working with governments, regulators, community, other stakeholder groups. And that's been something that's really been building up in these technical community organizations like the RIPE NCC for the last decade or so. I think if you went further back than that, you'd find there wasn't a whole lot of interest or a whole lot of competence or a whole lot of enthusiasm from the operator community in actually dealing with these issues. But I think our hand was kind of forced in a way. And what I want to talk about today is that some of the developments we're seeing currently, domestically here in the UK, across Europe, much more broadly, are really the situations that we've been preparing for a lot of that time. There's been a lot of discussion of this could happen, this is what the kind of control governments might try to take, these are the kinds of rules and regulations we might see. We're starting to see the rubber hit the road, in a sense, and now it's really crucial that the community pay attention and understand what some of these changes and developments are. So, I want to start quickly with just some context here about what it is we're talking about. Internet governance is a really fluffy term. There's no getting around that. And it covers a lot of different things. It covers national legislation and regulation, so the laws that your governments are making, local governments, national governments. It covers international law, which is a much more fuzzy area, but essentially is talking about things like United Nations conventions and the impact that they can have. It's talking about soft law, so this is like the work that, say, the OECD does in setting up guidelines, frameworks, best practices that a lot of governments and regulators might then use to make their own laws. And actually, it's also talking about the much more ad hoc arrangements that you often find between government and industry. And I think you'll find, well, plenty of specific examples of that. I won't necessarily point to any, but, well, I'll point to one. One that we've seen recently was, say, between operators in Belgium and the Belgian government in relation to the use of NATs on their networks and the allowable number of devices per IP address. Increasingly, it's also looking at technical standardization, the processes and outputs there. And so this is obviously IETF, but also looking at venues like the International Telecommunication Union, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then it's community policy development. So that's really coming back to RIPE, the RIPE community and the policies that they create around IP address management. And then the last one, in bold, because this is a theme I'm going to come back to a bit here, is the interplay between all of those. Because when you have that many different kinds of rulemaking going on, you're often going to find inconsistency between them. And that's actually becoming a really significant challenge for how we actually navigate internet governance. So if we're talking about specific internet governance issues, and there are many, many specific internet governance issues, one of the things that makes them complex is that they're actually working on a number of different dimensions, essentially. So, yeah, that trademark on multiverse is pending, but I feel good about it. I think it's going to work. The three that I sort of look at here is, okay, there are the issues and concerns. What's actually driving the push to regulate something or to make rules here? Is it about protecting citizens online? Is it about making a political point? Is it about trying to increase or ensure access to the internet? So then you look at the different structures and formations where you might try and actually exert that regulation. So you could go to your government and say, let's make a law about this. Or you could go to the OECD and say, let's try and work on a sort of best practice framework or a guidelines that will actually encourage governments to do this and encourage them to work with others. Or you might say, let's go to the IETF and just make a new standard, get an RFC up and actually try and direct what's going on here at the really technical layer. And so that's where you come then to those levers and tools. Within these different venues, you have different approaches that you might take. Do you want it to be a technical solution, which could be really specific and might not work in a broad sense, or do you want to try and do a very broad regulation, which then will be just worked around or not make a lot of sense to the operators who actually have to put this on their networks? And all of this kind of happens like this, and this is where the multi-stakeholder idea of internet governance gets really complicated, because it's not just about states telling network operators or users and citizens what to do. It's about states talking with other states, working through international organizations like the United Nations. It's about network operators working in collective structures like the RIRs or standard development organizations or IXP communities to address some of these issues. And it's also about the users and citizens and working in their collective groups like civil society organizations or like academia. So you have a lot of researchers who are also contributing to this. Now, since this is the UK, I figure I can use this reference and people will get it. Someone did at least. Yeah, that whole complex process kind of gets stomped on occasionally by developments in the real world. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, looking at what's actually driving some of the disruption and the push towards governance and regulation that we're seeing. And so I've got three big feet here that I wanted to talk a little bit about. The first is COVID-19. The second is the invasion of Ukraine. And the third is a slightly fuzzier one called internet governance proliferation. But each of these are actually contributing to this atmosphere that we're finding ourselves in now, where the risks and the developments are coming thick and fast, and it's really a challenge to keep up with them and work out the best response to them. So, COVID-19. This is not going to be an in-depth presentation on all of the impacts that COVID-19 has had on internet use. I've thrown up a few things here. You can look in any number of dimensions and ways, but COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19, particularly with the lockdowns and forcing people to be at home and rely on the internet, has really impacted the role of the internet in our society. It's allowed people to stay online and do their education. It's allowed people to work remotely, to have conferences remotely. It's allowed people to shop remotely. So there was even that taking another element of personal contact away. And that's had a lot of impacts on a lot of people. One thing you do see a little bit is an uptick there in the ITU's number of people who actually have access to the internet. So we did see in some countries that growth developing there. Now, this is obviously a trend that was already in place. There's no question of that. But I think the fact that there was this uptick, the fact that it was within this narrative of COVID-19 is changing our lives, the internet is facilitating that change, really contributed to what we're seeing. So if we go here, you've got more users on the internet, you've got more uses for the internet. Just look at Zoom and how that's entered the sort of lexicon these days. And you just have more use generally. So even the use that we were previously using it for, like streaming TV, spiked, went up. So what does that mean? Well, it means there's a greater need from a government perspective, from a society's perspective, to make sure that there is actually universal access. And that's, I think, coming back a little bit to the panel discussion before. I think that those kinds of questions of who has access, how do we ensure, how do we know that they're getting fair access are really top of mind. There's a greater need to protect the users online because you've got more people doing more stuff, contributing more information in a less expert way than ever before. So there is really, and as per the next one, an increase in online criminal activity. And so there was a session yesterday at Europol which was talking about the ways in which that criminal activity has increased over the COVID period. Things like ransomware, but also things like phishing and trying to really take advantage of this new group of people online and how much they're online. There's also a greater need to ensure fairness in the market, prevent abuse. So we're seeing things like platforms and how are they using their position in the market? How are they monopolies? Are they forming monopolies? What does that look like? And what can governments do to respond? There's increased occurrence and reach of disinformation and misinformation. That's obviously been going on a great deal in relation to COVID, not just because people are online, but also in relation to specific COVID issues like vaccines and like the lockdowns. And then there's challenges for the infrastructure providers. That's something that the ITU discussions have talked about quite a lot, is that the need for this growing networks, building more networks, has put a lot of pressure on the infrastructure providers. It's meant that rather than modernizing networks, they're having to just build out at the current level, and that's going to come back later on as networks that need to be updated. So it's really providing challenges, and I'm sure that's also true in the UK. So what you've got with all of those is this narrative. And really it is relatively easy to shape that as a narrative of, okay, this is important now. Government needs to get in the game. Government needs to take some control here, take some responsibility for the citizens that it's representing. Now, if you want to be cynical, you can say there are an awful lot of governments that were already thinking this is something we want to do, this is a space we need more control in. This is a perfect excuse. This is a perfect narrative for why we should do that. In a sense, it doesn't matter. The fact is that it's there, it happened, and now this is what we're seeing from governments. So the link between COVID-19 and what has happened in the last 2 years is probably not 100% clear. I think there were probably a lot of things that were in the works already, but have gained a lot of momentum, a lot of support, a lot of storyline around them because of COVID-19. And what we've seen has really been at a pace that dwarfs anything before. So from the EU, you've had the Digital Single Markets Act passed this year. Announced or draft published at the end of 2020, passed this year. Digital Markets Act, same thing. The NIS2, published at the same time, end of 2020, it's about to be passed. And so that's the Network and Information Security Act. Still coming up, we've got the Data Governance Act, again at the EU level. We've got the Cyber Resilience Act. So these are that's 5 major pieces of legislation that have come from the EU in just the last year, which have directly related to governance of the internet, regulation of the internet. Not even including there things like DNS for EU, which is another project that the European Commission launched and is a really practical step into the world of DNS resolvers. In the UK, and I'm not going to speak at length here, but the Online Safety Bill is a major thing, and I know Malcolm is going to say some more about this tomorrow. Just to point out here that, the UK's former Minister of State for Digital and Culture describes it as a mammoth piece of legislation that no one has ever attempted before. Those 2 articles, if you get the slides, you can go to the links, get a lot into that. But what we also are seeing is very similar kinds of legislation happening in Australia, in Canada, in Brazil, Japan, Korea. So a lot of countries that actually many of them on the sort of Western democracy end of the spectrum, if you want to think of that, but coming in with legislation that really is very prescriptive, very interventionist in a way that they haven't before. So that's 1 foot. Second foot. The invasion of Ukraine. Now I don't think I need to say to anyone, on the 24th of February, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine. That's been disastrous and catastrophic in a huge number of ways, and I think internet governance is probably one of the least concerning ways in comparison to what's going on there. But in this presentation, I'm talking about internet governance, so I'm going to focus on that. Politically, that really changed everything. What we've seen just in the last 92 days is a complete upending of the political dynamics that were existing prior to that. So there's an increase in temperature, an increase in the level of conflict that's happening diplomatically. There is a real change in how governments are reacting to each other, particularly in relation to a government like the Russian Federation. And that's playing out in a lot of the discussions that are happening about internet governance. Now, what we didn't see, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about this recently, is the cyber war aspect that many feared. So there have been a lot of these discussions in the UN about the next war will be fought in cyberspace. The next war will see a huge use of cyber warfare, attacking critical infrastructure. That hasn't actually happened yet, but it has still contributed to the elevation of those concerns in the UN, between governments, to a much higher pitch than they were before this. But I think the thing that I want to really focus on here is that governments have been looking at all of the levers they have, at how they can actually influence the decisions of the Russian government. Now, the one that is well known to everyone is sanctions. That's been a really powerful lever that governments have used to an extent that really they have never used it before. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's affected us. The other one that we've seen is this idea that perhaps organizations like the RIPE NCC or like ICANN could actually deregister Russian resources, and essentially, well, the thinking would be kick Russia off the internet. So both ICANN and the RIPE NCC and a number of other private organizations, Cloudflare, etc., received mails early on in this process from the Ukrainian government, actually from the Deputy Prime Minister, asking them to do this, asking the RIPE NCC to deregister Russian IP addresses, AS numbers, asking ICANN to deregister .ru from the root zone. So basically, the RIPE NCC's position and perspective here was pretty straightforward. We weren't going to do it. And I think one of the things that we understood there is that this is a very emotive moment, that there is a lot of logic and sense behind for the requesters that this should be done, that there should be whatever steps taken that could help them in relation to the invasion. But from the perspective of the RIPE NCC, this is not the remit that we had. This is not a step that we could take and still have that remit and have that trust. So yeah, if you wanted to learn more about that, it is tracking all the developments between the RIPE NCC and RIPE NCC members and Ukraine and Russia on a page there, so you can follow that. But I think the other important thing to know here is that actually deregistering those IP address resources in the RIPE database wouldn't have had the impact or the outcome that people in the Ukrainian government, for instance, were hoping it would have. It wouldn't actually disconnect them from the internet. What it would do is undermine trust in that comprehensive, accurate registry that the RIPE NCC is maintaining. And that's got much longer-term implications. So thinking about the outcomes then, and this is after incredibly only 92 days of this war so far. the global multi-stakeholder administrative model, so the RIPE NCC, ICANN, has actually held up exactly as intended. One of the things we've heard over the last 10 years, 20 years, from governments, including the Russian Federation especially, is that having these functions in the hands of private organizations or non-governmental organizations, which are based in Western countries, would mean that when a situation arose like this, those organizations would immediately roll over and do the politically easy thing, such as in this case deregistering Russia. The RIPE NCC, based in the Netherlands, didn't do that. ICANN, based in the US, didn't do that. What we have seen, though, is that the operator community, especially broadly in RIPE and particularly in Ukraine, has really proved itself to be very innovative and cooperative. And if you have a look at some of the recordings from last week's RIPE meeting, you'll see some really great stories about how the community is pulled together to deliver networking equipment to the Ukraine, about how the infrastructure for .ua was evacuated from Ukraine in the hours and days following the invasion. What we've also seen, and following using tools like RIPE Atlas, is that the internet in Ukraine has actually proved itself to be remarkably resilient. So while you have bombing going on, while you have Russian troops taking over areas, we've found that for the most part, the internet access to most parts of the Ukraine has remained intact. And that's been due to a sort of very well-structured and a lot of redundancies in the network that Ukraine developed over time. Coming back, though, to the other point, and as I say, that what we've seen so far from the multi-stakeholder model has been a really strong refutation to what Russia and others have said would happen. What they've also had concerns about, though, is that by having these organizations in Western countries, you'll see them having to be affected by sanctions, and that actually has come to pass. So the RIPE NCC has been dealing with the impact of sanctions on our services, on the ability to provide services to operators in Russia and other countries, Syria, Iran, Belarus, for a number of years now. And it really is a fundamental challenge to that multi-stakeholder system, because if that central registry role that we fulfill is kind of at the political whim of the jurisdiction in which we're based, in this case, the Netherlands, which is following EU sanctions, then that's a real risk for the trust and cooperation that's actually necessary for that global unified internet. And that's kind of what we keep coming to as our sort of North Star, that this need to ensure a global unified internet, which is what the global registry system is for, and which is what we're seeing under attack here. Now, this is an interesting case as well, because on the other side, we have in Russia a really strong example of the kinds of regulations that many fear, and in relation to internet governance. The Sovereign Internet Bill has been moving through Russian legislature for the last couple of years now. The most significant change since the invasion of Ukraine has been the shift from, okay, this is sort of what's on the books, but operators aren't really going to abide by it, to a much stronger, okay, you're going to do this now, network operators, you're going to actually make these changes. And the changes are really significant and intrusive. It's from using specific equipment to block forbidden content, registering all of their resources, including infrastructure and routing policies, with a regulator, so a separate database. IXPs must be registered and abide by specific rules, a national domain name system, which actually includes separate proxy DNS resolvers to be used by Russian operators, and then a raft of regulations for platform operators in the country. If you go to that RIPE Labs article, it's a bit old now, but as I say, the rules themselves haven't really changed from what the proposal was. What's changed is the idea that this is going to be a really hard and fast rule. So I'm going to hopefully come to the end sort of shortly. I'm sort of getting there. But the other point, the third big foot coming down here, is that proliferation. So we have those two drivers. We have COVID-19 putting a lot of pressure on governments to get more involved. We have the Ukrainian crisis drawing attention to challenges for that multi-stakeholder global governance model. What we now see is a huge amount of activity occurring in all of those different spaces, which I had in that colourful slide back at the beginning. And that simply means it's impossible, or very near impossible, to track all of it and to track the interaction between all of it. So just to list a few of them here. In the UN, you have an open-ended working group on essentially cybersecurity. So that's looking at how states interact, what states can do to each other or not do to each other in terms of cyber attacks. You've got an ad hoc committee that's working towards a convention on countering the use of ICTs. That actually came from a Russian proposal, and the atmosphere in those discussions has shifted significantly, but there is still a push from a really broad group of states to develop this convention. In the ITU, there's a plenipotentiary, which is the 4-year major conference of the ITU happening later this year. The two candidates for Secretary General are an American and a Russian. So whatever the outcome there, it's going to be a very political discussion, it's going to be a very political impact that's going to come there. And we've seen these discussions of new IP for the last few years in the ITU. That's been killed in a certain sense, but is likely to come back, where we have governments proposing standards that would actually redesign the internet in a way that allowed for much more centralized control by governments themselves. That links into that, finally, standardization is actually now high on the agenda of the G7 and the OECD. We have G7 making statements about technology standardization, which would not have happened several years ago. The Internet Governance Forum, meanwhile, is going on. This is another space where this was supposed to happen, and we're seeing multiple developments. We're seeing a new leadership panel. We're seeing a lot of documents coming from the Secretary General's office. We're seeing a move towards a digital global compact as part of a summit next year. I'm not going to get too much into the IGF, though. I do want to just come back to a bit of a summary as to what's changed here. What's different now than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? First, the internet has grown more crucial to how societies operate. I think we see that in statistics, but more importantly, I think we see that in how our societies are actually viewing this. I think if you look on the news, talking to people, people understand that having internet access, being safe online, is actually really critical to living in society today. That's led to governments actually making legislation and regulation that's specifically targeting internet use and operations. That's becoming a lot more common, not necessarily a lot better informed or better produced. We're seeing the increasing politicization of standards and governance. And I think we're seeing a shifting political window of what's considered acceptable regulatory impact. So you had 5 years ago a relatively stable alliance, let's say, of Western countries who would say, okay, that's too far. No, if you're doing this kind of regulation and it's having this kind of impact on operators, it's placing these kinds of restrictions, that's crazy. That's out the door. That window has shifted. So now we're not saying necessarily that what you see from the EU or the UK governments is the same as what the Russian government is proposing, but they're a lot closer than they once were. And that's a concerning development. And that's also leading to the last one, this increasingly active efforts at the UN level, the global level of policymaking. So, takeaways. I think one thing I would say is that a lot of governments are talking about this principle of maintaining a single, unfragmented internet. And that's great. That's the message that we've been pushing. That's what we like to see. coming out. There has been this recent declaration of principles from the US and EU and a number of other states. Then the key here is holding them to those positions. Because what we're seeing in a lot of the regulation coming from, say, the EU, doesn't live up to that ideal. It doesn't live up to the sense of we need to protect the administrative functions that allow us to have a global internet. And that's partly education. It's partly just getting into a fight and sort of saying, no, this is what you're doing here is going too far and is needlessly putting this at risk. It also just requires to know when this is happening, and that, as I say, that's a real challenge. So I think a multi-stakeholder approach is probably still our best defense against that sort of a fragmentation of the network and the fragmentation that can occur from regulation. When I did a presentation like this 6 months ago, I finished with, but multi-stakeholder models require multi-stakeholder engagement, which was the sort of call to action to get in there and talk to your governments. I'm going to add here the next but, which is, but that's becoming harder, because governments aren't necessarily looking to maintain these multi-stakeholder models. They're looking to do something, and that's when things get dangerous. When the priority is on do something rather than on work with everyone, take the time to do what is best. So I don't necessarily have great suggestions for that, but I think the best suggestion I have is talk to each other, follow what's going on, work with organizations, whether it be LINX or the RIPE NCC or others, who are going to take some active role in these discussions, and try and help inform that, provide the information and the expertise that's necessary to ensure that this doesn't go off the rails and in the wrong direction. And that's it for me. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We're running a little bit over. We might be able to take one question if there's anyone has a question for Chris. Oh, we do have one over there. Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a really informative and interesting presentation. I'd like to take you up on one specific area, if I may, on the impact of the Russia-Ukraine situation and the sanctions thing. RIPE NCC, of course, based in the Netherlands, it's within a jurisdiction that has a potential for an impact. As LINX, we became more particularly aware that we live in a jurisdiction as well and are subject to legal requirements. You have been successful in persuading the Netherlands and Europe not to require deregistration of addresses, and you've had a great story to tell in persuading them not to do that, by explaining that deregistering addresses wouldn't have the impact that people might naively assume it would. My question is about an area where it's slightly more difficult. Have you had anybody ask you to revoke RPKI certificates? And are you able to say anything about anything that the NCC, any thought the NCC has given to protecting the integrity of the RPKI signing well?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of different points here that it's worth separating out before I get to the RPKI thing, sorry. So there is that question of, being asked to deregister the resources, to just take the Russian objects out of the database. And that was never, well, I say it wasn't a question for us. It also wasn't really a question, I don't think, for the Dutch government. I don't think they had any inclination to ask us to do that. The bigger impact that we've had for sanctions is those economic sanctions which are targeted to individuals. And then if you have an individual with a link to an LIR, then we may be required to impose sanctions on that LIR. And what that's meant for us is freezing the registration. And that's based on discussions we've had with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's not severing the relationship completely, removing the resource. It's just saying, okay, you can't obtain any new resources, you can't sell the resources you have. I think, yeah, there are restrictions on registration information you can change or update. Now, we haven't had any specific requests to say revoke RPKI certificates, but RPKI certificates certainly fall within the kind of services that the RIPE NCC provides. So it's definitely, I think, an area that we're looking at as potentially risky down the line. And it's why, I mean, the focus that you've seen from RIPE NCC communications about this has absolutely been on compliance, because sanctions are big boy stuff. They're powerful tools. You know, there's criminal sanctions involved. There's jail time, probably not, but potentially for organization staff. So we've focused on, okay, we're going to make sure we're doing everything we can to comply with this. There's sort of a secondary thing in the background is to actually try and shift the needle to say, this is a problem. We need to actually get these rules changed, get these laws changed, probably at the EU level, to remove these kinds of services from the scope of these sanctions, even when they're applied to individuals, because the impact and the ramifications are much broader than just, okay, this guy over here can no longer make any money from selling his IP addresses. And I don't think it's the intention of the sanctions to have that kind of impact on the global internet. This is one of the many, many somewhat unintended consequences that economic sanctions can have, and that's sort of a much broader discussion of what's the role of sanctions. We're focused very much on the specific of how can we, you know, try and get this carve out for these core internet functions going forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.